Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My talk is entitled, as you can see, The Wonderful Inefficiencies of the Catholic Intellectual Traditions and the Beauty of Slow Learning. How to defend inefficiency in a culture which seems to value, above all, doing more and more quickly with as little effort as possible in order to have more. As I began to compose this talk, I became increasingly nervous, not only in my usual fashion of, do I have anything to say worth hearing, but also in my realization that there are probably experts in efficiency on this campus who might be taken aback by my lack of expertise. So I thought maybe I should look up efficiency to find out what the experts say. Of course, the most efficient way to do so these days is to appeal to an LLM, a large language model, aka artificial intelligence. So in the spirit of efficiency, I did. After all, LLMs promise to deliver the most salient points for any question. And this is what I found. Even exemplifying efficiency by highlighting for me the most salient point about efficiency, quote, the ability to achieve maximum productivity with minimum time, effort, or resources, end quote. And in case anyone is wondering, I posed this question 3 times using, according to Fareed Zakaria, the equivalent of 24 seconds of using a microwave. Then I started feeling a little guilty relying on Google's LLM. It's not a very good example for students, so I decided to do a search through UD's library system. And the search revealed this. Who knew that I would have to pursue 9,751,177 items? And I began to wonder whether this discussion of efficiency was still all that efficient. Given my feeling of being overwhelmed, I sought a kind of Goldilocks summation of efficiency. What would Wikipedia have to tell me about efficiency? Not only did the author of the article offer various types of efficiency related to physics, economics, and other sciences, including our beloved computer algorithms, but it also offered a list of different kinds of inefficiency. Who knew? Certainly not me. What this little search taught me was that even in pursuing the study of efficiency, humans do not necessarily display efficiency. But what are these so-called inefficiencies? Perhaps they can help categorize the inefficiency of Catholic intellectual traditions. Are the inefficiencies of CIT allocative or distributive or Keynesian or Pareto or some other kind of inefficiency? Well, I have often thought in my own engagement with CIT that I could do a better job. But as the Wikipedia author notes, sometimes it's just not possible due to limits in resources and technology. Or perhaps it's a Keynesian sense. I am acutely aware that I can never completely use all the resources of CIT, which probably exceed the 9 million plus on efficiency. I do not think the inefficiency is of the Pareto sort, where my engagement diminishes another, at least I hope not. In fact, my engagement is usually with and for others. Yet, if I return to my LLM companion, who informed me that efficiency has to do with achieving, quote, maximum productivity with minimum time, effort, or resources, I find myself wondering about maximums and minimums, products and measurements of time, effort, and resources. And then I found myself called out in reading Leo XIV's apostolic letter, Drawing New Maps of Hope, on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Vatican Declaration on Education. Quote, 60 years ago, Gravissimum Educationis, that is the title of the Vatican II degree, heralded a season of trust. It encouraged the updating of methods and languages. Today, this trust is being tested by the digital environment. Technologies must serve, not replace the person. They must enrich the learning process, not impoverish relationships and communities. A university and a Catholic school without vision risks soulless efficiency, the standardization of knowledge, which then becomes spiritual impoverishment. So then I return to one of my favorite descriptions of Catholic intellectual traditions, from Bill Portier's book, Tradition and Incarnation, Foundations of Christian Theology. Dr. Portier, a longtime friend and colleague and professor emeritus here at UD, whose presence in our department is sorely missed, describes tradition as a kind of context, using this image, quote, the sea of historical connections, linguistic, national, and religious, in which individuals swim. He also describes it as, quote, an inheritance which is alive and constantly being refashioned by individuals who inhabit it and contribute to its ongoing conversation, end quote. His choice of conversation suggests that tradition is something participative, dynamic, changing, inviting debate, and sometimes disagreement about how we might inhabit this inheritance. Out of curiosity, I looked up conversation on the Etymology Online Dictionary, so I didn't completely abandon the digital, and discovered just how apt conversation is as a metaphor for tradition. Appearing in the mid-14th century, it refers to, quote, a place where one lives or dwells, or a general course of actions or habits, manner of conducting oneself in the world, end quote. Those meanings, now obsolete, at least according to Etymology Online, had their origin in conversation, the Old French, which referred to behavior, life, way of life, monastic life, which in turn came from the Latin conversationem, frequent use, frequent abode in a place, intercourse, and simply conversation, and as a noun of action from past participle stem of conversari, to live, to dwell, to live with, to keep company with. Its root meanings are con, which means together or with, and conversare, which means to turn or to bend. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Who cares, besides me and fellow etymology nerds, which I hope there are many listening to this lecture, and I'm telling you this because I think that etymology reveals something about what Dr. Portier had in mind when he used ongoing conversation to characterize tradition. Tradition's ongoing conversation is more like a place that we inhabit as we try to navigate the sea of historical connections in which we swim, at times to plumb the depths, and at other times to chart new courses, as the connections dissolve or morph into different and even new connections. This description of tradition, by the way, concludes his chapter entitled The Great Questions, and not the definitive answers. The questions he mentions concern birth, death, love, suffering, and evil. Questions that can frustrate and inspire precisely because they evade singular and conclusive answers. As I was reading the Etymology Online entry on conversation, I thought of the Benedictine way of life. Men and women who enter a Benedictine monastery take 3 vows: obedience, stability, and conversatio morum. On the Conception Abbey website, contemporary website, the Latin phrase is translated as, quote, fidelity to the monastic way of life, described as the total self-offering of the monk to God, including renunciation of personal possessions and embracing celibacy for the sake of the kingdom, end quote. The Old French conversation referred to a way of life, even monastic life, and one of the Latin forms means, quote, to live, to keep company with. Conversation in this sense of keeping company with those seeking the kingdom remains central to the Benedictine way of life, and so perhaps the meaning is not obsolete. Jean Leclerc's title of the classic text on monastic thought, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God, captures this so beautifully. From the first moment I was assigned this book in graduate school several eons ago to now, I am always struck that love of learning precedes the desire for God. Learning is an expression of that desire, and the Benedictines' conversation enacted what is the radical meaning of the word, that is, at its very root, to turn together toward the transcendent, toward God, the source of love, and in doing so toward the neighbor, and in a real sense to bend toward that mystery of love. Part of the wonderful inefficiency of Catholic intellectual traditions comes from the kind of questions that are pursued. One of the most basic and central to our common academic program here at UD is, what does it mean to be human? Now, I couldn't find a slide from UD with this, so there you have it. Jews and Christians might rephrase the question, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? As the first chapter of Genesis insists, a sacred text that both Jews and Christians share. Other questions long explored concern our ultimate origins in light of the origins of all that exists. Such explorations find their inspiration, at least in part, by the profession of faith, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. And let me note that believe in this context should not be understood as something like, I believe that it is going to snow tomorrow. Rather, it is more akin to pledging oneself. Such declarations of commitment provide a certain freedom to explore every nook and cranny of existence with a confidence that there is something to discover. In the chapter Intricacy in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Annie Dillard reflects on the freedom to explore all those nooks and crannies. And here I'm going to read a rather long quote from her, but it's such a wonderful quote. Quote, freedom cuts both ways. Mystery itself is as fringed and intricate as the shape of the air in time. Forays into mystery cuts bays and fine fjords, but the forested mainland itself is implacable both in its bulk and its most filigreed fringe of detail. Every religion that does not affirm that God is hidden, said Pascal flatly, is not true. What is man that thou art mindful of him? This is where the great modern religions are so unthinkably radical, the love of God. For we can see that we are as many as the leaves of trees, but it could be that our faithlessness is a cowering cowardice born of our very smallness, a massive failure of imagination. Certainly nature seems to exult in abounding radicality, extremism, anarchy. If we were to judge nature by its common sense or likelihood, we wouldn't believe the world existed. In nature, improbabilities are the one stock in trade. The whole creation is one lunatic fringe. If creation had been left up to me, I'm sure I wouldn't have had the imagination or courage to do more than shape a single, reasonably sized atom, smooth as a snowball, and let it go at that. No claim at any and all revelations could be so far-fetched as a single giraffe. The question from agnosticism is, who turned on the lights? The question from faith is, whatever for? End of Annie Dillard's quote. Faith also invites lots more questions about this creator, including what it means to call the Divine Father. And guess what? We are hardly the first to converse on that topic of gender and the divine. Christians also profess that God became incarnate in a particular person, Jesus. And that commitment brings us back to that first question. If that is true, that God became human in Jesus, then what indeed does it mean to be human? And what are the fuller implications of that? Augustine provides us a model of this kind of meandering inefficiencies in contemplating the incarnation. Born in 354 in a small town in what is today Algeria, Augustine, with his mother Monica's support, sought the upward mobility of his era. The 11-year-old began his schooling in Latin about 20 miles from his home. In an interesting twist of fate, Augustine never learned Greek, since his introduction to the language came from the school's teacher, who evidently employed beatings to encourage learning. Augustine refused to submit, perhaps a glimmer of his later tenaciousness. At 17, thanks to a wealthy patron, he began his studies in rhetoric at Carthage, a beneficiary of a 4th century version of a scholarship. An introduction to Cicero's dialogue Hortensius enkindled his lifelong desire to pursue wisdom. Here also, much to his Christian mother's consternation, he began his 10-year sojourn as a Manichaean auditor, seeking the promise of salvation through an esoteric knowledge to escape the evil material world. In Carthage, also much to his mother's displeasure, he entered into a 15-year relationship with a woman with whom he had a son, a Deodatus, gift from God. From 373 to 383, he tried his hand at teaching grammar, first in his hometown of Tagaste, and after a year in Carthage. After 10 years, fed up with his recalcitrant students, I love this detail in his life, he decided to seek his fame and fortune in Rome, teaching. He found better students who, unfortunately for him, failed to compensate him for his services. Through some Manichaean friends, Augustine met the prominent Roman official, Symmachus, who appointed him professor of rhetoric in Milan, where he encountered the city's bishop, Ambrose, who helped him to integrate the Neoplatonism that he had been studying with the Christian faith. At 31, through his conversation with Ambrose and with many other friends, Augustine turned toward Christianity. His conversion, sealed by his baptism 2 years later in 388. 10 years later, at the age of 43, Augustine wrote his Confessions, a conversation with God about the first 4 decades of his intellectual meandering toward God, spurred onward by his restless heart longing for rest in God, only to discover that the path to God ran right through the goodness of creation revealed in the Word made flesh. His meandering continued 32 more years, informed by his preaching, adjudicating communal disagreements, responding to letters, seeking guidance, not to mention his many other writings, including on Christian doctrine, which became the medieval guide for scripture interpretation, and his voluminous The City of God, trying to make the sense of the collapse of his world, aka the Roman Empire. One does not have to agree with everything that Augustine wrote to find him a fruitful conversation partner. In his apostolic letter on education, Pope Leo XIV, an Augustinian, wrote the following, quote, St. Augustine, grafting biblical wisdom onto the Greco-Roman tradition, understood that the authentic teacher arouses the desire for truth, educates freedom to read the signs, and listen to the inner voice. Another version of the love of learning and the desire for God. Dorothy Day offers another model of the wonderful inefficiencies of CIT. Interestingly enough, her autobiography opens with her waiting to go to confession, purposefully echoing Augustine's own confession. Born in 1887, Day's account of her childhood prepared her readers to accept her identification with Kirillov from Dostoevsky's novel, The Possessed, who exclaimed, "All my life I have been haunted by God." Even the efficiencies of the works of mercy were awakened at an early age when she witnessed the communal response to the devastation of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In 1907, her family moved to Chicago. Here began her education, mostly through reading on her own from Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo, Les Mis, to Jack London, Upton Sinclair, and even the communitarian anarchist Peter Kropotkin. Besides this reading, her spiritual sojourn included catechism at an Episcopal church, leading to her baptism and confirmation. At 16, with the aid of a scholarship, she entered University of Illinois, where she encountered kindred spirits among the socialists. Though inspired by the Christian faith she encountered in Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, she saw little evidence of such faith in the Christians around her. After 2 years, she left the university, following her family to New York City, where she put to use and honed her powerful gift of observation, working as a journalist for socialist newspapers. Her reading list continued to grow to include Ignacio Salone, Aldous Huxley, William James, Francois Mauriac, as well as Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and The Imitation of Christ. She continued her conversations with committed socialists and communists, and even joined the suffragettes' effort to win the vote for women. The playwright Eugene O'Neill became a companion, and he encouraged her to read Augustine's Confessions. After nights of conversation with O'Neill and others at dive bars par excellence, she sought the early morning quiet of St. Joseph's Church in the village. Yet her meandering, like Augustine's, was deeply informed by her own restless heart, her search for something more. Her love life was a disaster, including an abusive relationship, an abortion, attempted suicide, and a year-long marriage ending in divorce, all of which became her novel, eventually sold for movie rights, giving her enough money to purchase a small home, where the love of her life, Foster Battingham, joined her. Of that relationship, she wrote, "I have always felt that it was life with him that brought me natural happiness, that brought me to God," end quote. She writes of the wonder that surrounded her, and again, a longer quote. "Late this afternoon, the wind dropped, and I sat by the open door contemplating the sunset. The waves lapped the shore, tinkling among the shells and pebbles, and there was an acrid odor of smoke in the air. Down the beach, the Belgians were working, loading rock into a small cart, which looked like a tumbril, drawn by a bony white horse. They stooped as though in prayer, outlined against the brilliant sky, and as I watched, the bell from the chapel over at St. Joseph's rang the Angelus. I found myself praying with thanksgiving, praying with open eyes, while I watched the workers on the beach, the sunset, and listened to the sound of the waves and the scream of snowy gulls," end quote. Her prayer encompassed all that surrounded her, from the workers to the sights and smells of the shore to the church bell. In 1928, Dorothy gave birth to a daughter, Tamar Therese. Over the strong objections of Foster, a confirmed atheist who rejected all institutions, especially the church, Day sought to have her daughter baptized, and Day soon followed. It was 1927, she was 30. In her 1952 autobiography, she recalled how begetting a child made me have a sense that we were made in the image and likeness of God, co-creator with him. She credited the inveterate atheist Foster with her overwhelming sense of gratitude. Quote, "He had introduced me to so much that was beautiful and good that I felt I owed him too this renewed interest in the things of the Spirit," end quote. Like Augustine, her meanderings had not ended with entrance into the church. 5 years of uncertainty about her life's direction ended when Peter Morin appeared in her apartment. From him, she came to understand more fully the truly radical nature of Christianity revealed in the Sermon on the Mount and enacted through the works of mercy, understood, as Day would write, that, quote, "If we hadn't got Christ's own word for it, it would seem raving lunacy to believe that if I offer a bed and food and hospitality to some man or woman or child, I am replaying the part of Lazarus or Martha or Mary, and that my guest is Christ," end quote. Peter Morin had given her a vision that became the Catholic Worker, enacted through houses of hospitality, the publishing of a newspaper to educate the ignorant, roundtable discussions for clarification of thought, and agronomic universities where scholars become workers and workers become scholars. Day's meandering and her search for the more continued until her death in 1980. Day provides a concrete and innovative example of Leo XIV's account of Catholics, particularly in religious orders. Day was a laywoman, who dedicated themselves to educating the poor and the ignorant. Quote, "This genealogy of practical action testifies that in the church, pedagogy is never disembodied theory, but flesh, passion, and history," end quote. Such pedagogy spills out of the classroom into the daily life of those committed to entering more fully into the lives of service. The newspaper, the roundtable discussions were all part of an educational project and extends far beyond any 4-year college experience. And we here have not even broached the subject of cost here at this university that places so much pressure on students and their families, which asks them to really avoid meandering to finish up. But both Augustine and Day, even though they benefited from scholarships, their schooling was only the jumping off point for the beauty of the slow learning that takes a lifetime. The kind of questions that Day and Augustine pursued are very much akin to those that I have loved to pursue for well over 50 years. Such questions fill me with wonder. Yet, as I was reminded in reading Colin McGuigan's dissertation, The Paschal Event of Wonder, Pope Francis, Planetary Crisis and the Capacity for Surprise, Feelings of wonder are not always pleasant or joyful. The detonation of a nuclear bomb fills me with an awful wonder, speechless amazement and puzzlement over humans' capacity to create something so terrifyingly destructive. Dorothy Day even gave witness to the horror in her refusal to participate in civil defense drills. I am filled with shaking my head wonder when I consider why individuals, including myself at times, seem to take pleasure in being cruel to others, both virtually and face to face. These examples involve human choices, often informed by a complex web that masks their destructiveness. Yet I have also felt the anguished wonder in the presence of a friend grieving over losing a child to debilitating illness, or the death of a person whose life held such promise for all that is good, true, and beautiful. Surely not choices in those cases. Dr. McGuigan wrestles with these questions in the company of Pope Francis, whose wonder involves a crucifixion, a death to self, a surrendering of one's security, of understanding and mastery of action. Yet crucifixion is not the story's final end. As McGuigan explains, this crucifixion, quote, would not be a paschal event without the hope of resurrection, and that is the promise of wonder, new, greater meaning and abundance of life, end quote. After the seeming definitive end of Jesus' life and crucifixion, the resurrection comes as a wonder, an utter surprise. In describing Pope Francis' engagement with the present time, McGuigan writes, quote, prior experience of surprising wonders, the resurrection foremost among them, motivate this hopeful conviction in latent possibilities, which become a driving, motivating force of historical creativity for Bergoglio, that's Pope Francis. Only with our capacity for surprise intact can we approach reality with an open heart, with our defensive preconceptions lowered and our egocentricity quieted. In the open vulnerability of heart and mind, characteristic of wonder, we are prepared to acknowledge reality's transcendence of ourself and to receive the personal reality of another. Wonder opens us up to the truth, goodness, and beauty of what is other than us, end quote. As I noted previously, seeing reality in the light of the incarnation revealed in the ministry of Jesus, which culminates in his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension, informs and inspires every aspect of Catholic intellectual traditions. How do we measure this capacity for wonder, for surprise? What is sufficient input to get out the appropriate results? Perhaps McGuigan's insight into the wonder of wonder, especially in light of the Paschal event, helps us understand why Catholic intellectual traditions are wonderfully inefficient. Surprise seems to go against the grain of efficiencies, especially when the source of such surprises is that which transcends all our knowing and escapes our attempt to quantify and limit in the name of efficiency. Of course, even efficiency experts evidently can't resist writing one more article on its import. Now I know that there are many here at the University of Dayton who do not profess a belief in Jesus as God incarnate, though they do share in a believing commitment to the transcendent revealed in Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Baha'i, and many other spiritual baths that I am probably failing to remember, and I say this with apologies. I am also quite aware of others who make important contributions to our life together at the University of Dayton who do not believe in God or are agnostic about God's existence. I can't help but note at this juncture that at least in some cases, the God that they don't believe in is one that I don't believe in either. But what I can assure them is my belief in God provides the freedom for me to do the intellectual work that I do. And with great confidence, I think it also gives them the freedom to do the work that they do. I take McGuigan's description to heart, quote, in the open vulnerability of heart and mind, characteristic of wonder, we are prepared to acknowledge reality's transcendence of ourselves and to receive the personal reality of another. Wonder opens us up to the truth, goodness, and beauty of what is other than us, end quote. This understanding of reality is the context, the tradition, if you will, of utter freedom that encompasses all that exists. A Catholic university makes perfect sense to me in light of this acknowledgement of a creator who both causes us and every other thing to be and continues to interact with us. And here I turn to Charles Taylor's Marianist lecture, A Catholic Modernity. In explaining Catholic, Taylor turns to its etymology, another etymology nerd, appealing to the, quote, original word katalu in two related senses comprising both universality and wholeness. This is Taylor. One might say universality through wholeness, end quote. For Taylor, wholeness is intimately related to redemption, which he describes as the weaving of God's life into human lives. And then he notes that, quote, these human lives are different, plural, irreducible to each other, end quote. The wholeness that Taylor has in mind comes through redemption hyphen incarnation, end quote, which, quote, brings reconciliation, end quote, that recognizes that we do not come to wholeness alone. He concludes that Catholic calls for, quote, a unity across difference as against unity through identity, end quote. Not as the best we can do, but rather rooted in, quote, the life of God itself understood as Trinitarian, already a oneness of this kind, that is, as unity across difference. Human diversity is part of the way in which we are made in the image of God. That's Taylor. And he continues, quote, no widening of faith without an increase in the variety of devotions and spiritualities and liturgical forms and responses to incarnation. Such an increase surely evokes that wonder which opens us up to the truth, goodness, and beauty of what is other than us. Taylor readily admits that the Catholic Church has too often failed to respect such difference, and at the same time also offers examples in which such difference is championed. The 15th century Spanish Catholics who came to the land, the 15th and 16th century Spanish Catholics who came to the land now called the Americas, included those who fostered coercion of the native people to Spanishize them and thus Catholicize them into kind of unity through identity. But there were also individuals like Bartolomé de las Casas and Antonio de Montesino who defended the native people's rights and recognized a kind of unity across difference. So in light of that, now let me turn to the work and my final example, the work of Alex Garcia Rivera, to consider the beauty of slow learning in light of this Catholicism as unity across difference, particularly in his work, The Community of the Beautiful. Garcia Rivera is another outstanding exemplar of the wonderful inefficiencies of Catholic intellectual traditions. Part of the Cuban exile community, he turned away from his family's Catholicism toward the study of physics. Quote, a love for the logic of nature promised me certain answers to the deep questions that had arisen in the tragic experience of exile that was the bitter lot of my family, end quote. He succeeded, landing a job with Boeing. His work took, as he wrote, quote, a tragic turn, end quote, when he, quote, suddenly realized, end quote, that the air-launched cruise missile he was helping design via computer programming would become, quote, the concrete reality of an atomic explosion aimed at a large community of people, end quote. With that realization, perhaps a wonder, he could no longer remain a physicist. Married to, this is his description, a good Lutheran woman from Ohio, he joined her for Bible study where he encountered, quote, the captivating story, could we say surprising, of the Creator God, who sent his son to be born of a humble woman, even while the cosmos sang and kings paid homage, only to be crucified unjustly in order to rise again, end quote. His captivation led to his becoming a Lutheran pastor, whose first assignment was in Allentown, PA, to a dual congregation, the English-speaking downstairs and the Spanish-speaking Puerto Ricans upstairs. He then describes the community's distinct Christmas decoration, the English-speaking with their stately fir tree covered in simple white lights, and the Puerto Ricans with a 4-foot artificial tree covered in tinsel with a dizzying array of flashing colored lights. The English speakers expressed horror at the quote-unquote gaudy display upstairs. The Spanish speakers dismay at the lifeless decorations downstairs. Eventually, the Puerto Ricans wanted their own church, bearing the name of a Catholic saint, St. Martin de Porres, second only to Our Lady of Guadalupe in devotion, according to Garcia Rivera. In explaining the request to his bishop, the bishop first heard Martin Luther, and Garcia Rivera had to correct him. No, no, no. The name got its approval, and so St. Martin de Porres Lutheran Church was founded. Yet, Garcia Rivera came to another realization in this process, that he had first encountered the beauty of this difference in the faith of his childhood, and so he returned to the Roman Catholic Church. He also decided, quote, to finish his doctorate not in physics, the love of the logic of nature, but in theology, the love of the logic of a loving wisdom, end quote. His first book was about Martin de Porres, the little stories of Martin de Porres. Sadly, Alex Garcia Rivera passed in 2010 at the age of 59, and his memory continues to be a blessing. In his 1999 book, The Community of the Beautiful, Garcia Rivera guides his readers through a dense and a very rich discussion of the beautiful, which he introduces in this way, quote, thus the reader ought to be prepared for what I hope will be a process of interpretive musement, a phrase he borrows from the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, which attends to the delightful variety of branches in which Garcia Rivera describes as a quote-unquote treetop level thinking, which allowing a vision of the whole. These branches include Hispanic theology, semiotics, logic, truth, goodness, beauty, capitalized here, Charles Sanders Peirce, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Josiah Rice, who was a Peirce student, and so on. And he's seeking a vision of the whole from treetop level. That is a theological aesthetics of lifting up the lowly, end quote. His hope is that, quote, by the end of the book, the reader has come to feel the gravitational pull such treetop thinking affords and has joined me in the vision these particular heights allow, the dazzling vision of the community of the beautiful, end quote. What Garcia Rivera also makes very clear that while he is inviting us to join him in the treetops, he remains firmly grounded in, quote, the Latin Church of the Americas, end quote, a community of the beautiful whose experience of beauty takes place, quote, in the furnace of a violent history, end quote. Given that there is no way that I can do justice to his complex argument in the remaining time for this talk, I will simply commend his book to you. But what I do want to dwell on here is how Garcia Rivera, grounded in the, quote, long tradition of Latin American theology, focuses on the centrality of aesthetics, quote, the philosophy and science of the beautiful, end quote, to explore and better understand that which moves the heart. Obviously, when he uses heart, he is not referring to the muscle pumping blood through our bodies, but that, quote, place where good and evil inclinations are shaped and formed, end quote. What Augustine called his restless heart, and Day her divine haunting. In exploring this movement of the heart, Garcia Rivera appeals to the rabbinic teaching concerning the human heart, which houses both Yetzer Hara, a tendency towards evil, and Yetzer HaTov, a tendency toward good. Garcia Rivera calls this tendency the Yetzer, the imagination of the heart, God's gift to the human creature, end quote. This gift of the imagination of the heart requires, quote, discerning, an act of discovery as much as an act of expression, guided by aesthetic principles, the principle which moves the heart. Garcia Rivera identifies, quote, lifting up the lowly from Mary's hymn of praise as that principle. This principle fosters, quote, a creative act of the good imagination, in which beauty reveals its theological dimension in difference, end quote. The difference signified in God's scattering the proud in their conceit, in the conceit of their imagination, and lifting up the lowly. And in the different beauty revealed in Our Lady of Guadalupe, quote, a sign in the sacramental sense of the beautiful, which manifests itself as difference. She is both Mary of faith, Mother of God, and Jesus of Nazareth, as well as Mary of wisdom, the brown mother of Mexico, embraced by the sun and wrapped by the stars, end quote. she emerges from the furnace of a violent history. And this Mary, who lifts up the lowly, is surely the guide of our Catholic and Marianist mission. Garcia Rivera's beauty, revealed in difference, echoes Taylor's no widening of faith without an increase in the variety of devotions and spiritualities and liturgical forms and responses to the Incarnation. Garcia Rivera adds a depth to the beauty of slow learning in his own complex journey that gave us this book and also challenges us to consider the demands of cultivating the imagination of the heart guided by lifting up the lowly. He also reminds us the beauty of slow learning does not excuse our slowness in learning the inviolable dignity of each and every creature. He notes the traces of the Yetzarian imagination embedded in the New Testament call for metanoia, a conversion of the heart, elsewhere in the New Testament described as seeing with the eye of the heart in the light of Jesus the Christ. Or as Benedict opens his rule to listen and thus learn with the ears of the heart, which brings us back to conversation, turning toward one another. Many times over the course of a semester, I have witnessed the beauty of slow learning as my students in conversation with our readings, themselves through writing, and each other in discussion come to some new insights led by that, quote, creative act of the good imagination, end quote, that deepens their sense of the wonder of our existence and the beauty found in unity across difference. One of the things that surprised me as I completed this talk was how often the heart made an appearance in a talk about Catholic intellectual traditions. And so it brings me back to Leo's apostolic letter on education. Quote, "We must also be careful not to fall into the trap of an enlightenment of a fides paired exclusively with ratio. We need to emerge from the shallows by recovering an empathic and open vision, and to understand better how humankind understands itself today in order to develop and deepen our teaching. This is why desire and the heart must not be separated from knowledge. It would mean splitting the person. Catholic universities and schools are places where questions are not silenced and doubt is not banished, but accompanied. The heart there dialogues with the heart, and the method is that of listening that recognizes the other as an asset, not a threat. Educating is an act of hope and a passion that is renewed because it manifests the promise we see in the future of humanity," end quote. So let the conversation continue here at the University of Dayton in the company of Mary, who never ceases to call us to join her in God's work of lifting up the lowly. Thank you.